sight of Göbekli Tepe really did send shockwaves through the whole world of early prehistory, because we'd never before known or imagined even that simple hunter-gatherers could produce such spectacular monumental structures.
They knew it would end. Those were Klaus Schmidt's final cryptic words, a message scribbled in his notebook just days before his death. The man who uncovered Göbekli Tepe, the world's oldest temple, had spent his life rewriting human history. But in his last months, his excitement turned to dread. He spoke of patterns repeating, of civilizations that rose only to vanish, and of a terrifying truth buried beneath those ancient stones that, he warned, might soon concern us all. Klaus Schmidt's final moments. In the summer of 2014, the man who had changed our understanding of human history sat quietly by a swimming pool in Germany. On July 20th, Klaus Schmidt suffered a sudden heart attack and passed away. The news stunned the archaeological world. For years, Schmidt had been the face of Göbekli Tepe, the man who had unearthed what many now call the world's first temple, but few knew the turmoil that haunted him in the final months of his life. Those close to him recalled that he had grown anxious, restless, and almost paranoid. He would often speak in half sentences, murmuring that there were things he could no longer keep hidden. Born on December 11, 1953, in Feuchtwangen, Germany, Schmidt had always been drawn to the deep past. He studied prehistory, proto-history, and classical archaeology at the universities of Erlangen and Heidelberg, eventually earning his PhD in 1983 under the guidance of Harald Hauptmann. His early years were marked by precision and patience. He secured funding from the German Archaeological Institute, received grants from the German Research Foundation, and worked at the Heidelberg Institute of Prehistory and Protohistory. During these years, he learned to read the landscape like a language, tracing subtle clues that most eyes missed. His surveys across the Near East taught him that the Earth hides its truths in layers, sometimes buried deliberately, sometimes by time itself. Then came Göbekli Tepe. His discovery there in the 1990s was nothing short of revolutionary. Massive T-shaped pillars carved with foxes, snakes, and vultures revealed that organized religion and monumental architecture existed thousands of years earlier than scholars had believed possible. In his last months, Schmidt turned his attention away from Göbekli Tepe toward a nearby, lesser-known site, Göbekli Tepe, nestled a few kilometers southeast of Şanlıurfa. It was smaller, quieter, but for Schmidt, it was the missing piece of a puzzle that refused to leave his mind. Göbekli Tepe, part of the Taş Tepeler cluster of Neolithic sites, shared some traits with Göbekli Tepe, but its structures seemed simpler, humbler, as if they had been built after something immense had already ended. Schmidt began to believe that Göbekli Tepe wasn't the beginning of civilization as he once thought, but rather the mark of its first collapse. He saw a terrifying pattern emerging, societies that rose to build monuments, only to abandon them, leaving behind silence and decay. Göbekli Tepe's builders had vanished, replaced by smaller, weaker settlements like Göbekli Tepe. The temple, he thought, wasn't just a sanctuary. It might have been a warning, a monument to something humanity had lost and was destined to lose again. Schmidt never had the chance to publish these final thoughts. His sudden death ended a journey that had begun with discovery and ended with dread. Yet his unfinished notes and fragments of correspondence still whisper of a revelation he never made public. Before his death, he told a colleague that something was still alive beneath the earth. What secret lay buried there, and why did he feel such urgency to uncover it before he died? Let's find out. The hidden site beneath modern streets. Just a few kilometers southeast of Şanlıurfa, beneath the hum of traffic and the shadow of concrete houses, lies a place that once held the pulse of an ancient world, Göbekli Tepe. Most passers-by have no idea what rests beneath their feet. The site, spread over roughly 1,200 by 800 meters on the northwestern edge of the Harran Plain, is now mostly hidden under modern streets and buildings. Only the trained eye can recognize the faint rises in the landscape, the shallow humps that were once living settlements. Beneath those mounds, 8 in total, known as Göbekli Tepe 1 through 8, rests a forgotten world from nearly 10,000 years ago. 4 of these are shallow tells, the others flat, yet each layer tells a story of how life evolved, endured, and perhaps declined. When the German Archaeological Institute and the Schönlurfa Museum launched a joint project between 1995 and 1999, Göbekli Tepe was never meant to steal the spotlight. The world's attention was on Göbekli Tepe, where Klaus Schmidt and his team were uncovering towering pillars and mysterious animal carvings. But Schmidt quietly pushed for exploration here too, believing that Göbekli Tepe might hold the missing link between the sacred world of Göbekli Tepe and the everyday lives that followed. He directed small-scale excavations on Mounds 1 and 2 and opened test trenches on 3 and 4 to read the layers of time like pages in a buried book. What they found astonished him. The team uncovered figurines carved from limestone, men, women, and shapes whose gender was uncertain, their faces worn smooth by time. These small sculptures hinted at a spiritual life woven into the routine of survival. They weren't grand idols for massive temples, but humble symbols meant for hands and homes. Animal bones told their own story. Sheep and goats dominated the remains, along with pigs, cattle, and wild creatures like gazelles and foxes. It was a mixed world, part domestic, part wild, caught between hunting and herding, between old ways and new. The deeper the team dug, the clearer the contrast became. Göbekli Tepe, with its monumental architecture and sacred aura, had always been seen as humanity's first leap into organized religion. Göbekli Tepe, however, reflected the return to simplicity. Gone were the towering T-shaped pillars. In their place stood small homes, modest hearths, and quiet figurines. It seemed civilization had taken a step backward, or perhaps had been forced to. Archaeologists now believe Göbekli Tepe may hold the key to understanding how people moved from ritual hilltops to practical plains, from worship to survival. Its layers show continuity, life that endured rather than vanished. Beneath Göbekli Tepe's calm surface, Schmidt sensed a disturbing truth. The tools and figurines seem not to mark evolution, but regression. What could have driven the builders of Göbekli Tepe to abandon their temples and retreat into simpler lives? Civilization in collapse. By the late 1990s, Klaus Schmidt's fascination with Göbekli Tepe had turned into an obsession. What he saw there didn't fit the story he had once helped to tell, that human history was a steady climb from chaos to civilization. The deeper he studied, the more it seemed that something had gone terribly wrong after the glory of Göbekli Tepe. The pillars, symbols, and carvings that once reflected mastery and vision were gone. In their place were crude tools and simple figurines, like echoes of a people starting over from the ashes of something grander. The tools from Göbekli Tepe were far less refined than those found at Göbekli Tepe. Their edges were uneven, their shapes more practical than elegant. The fine craftsmanship that had defined the earlier period seemed to have vanished. Many of the stone blades were broken, hastily shaped, or reused, signs of a society making do with what it had. Even the figurines told the same story. They were smaller, less detailed, and carried little of the symbolic majesty seen in earlier carvings. Instead of towering depictions of gods or guardians, these figures were personal, domestic symbols of survival rather than ceremony. For Schmidt, the evidence pointed toward a chilling possibility. What if Göbekli Tepe wasn't a continuation of progress, but the beginning of a recovery after a collapse? He began to suspect that humanity's earliest civilization hadn't emerged in a straight line, but in cycles, rising to astonishing heights only to fall, then begin again on humbler ground. Göbekli Tepe might have been the climax, and Göbekli Tepe its aftermath. The difference between them wasn't evolution, but consequence. He described it as a civilization restarting after its own ruin. The great builders of Göbekli Tepe may have exhausted themselves or faced some crisis that forced them to abandon their monuments and retreat into simpler, sustainable lives. The shift from monumental architecture to modest villages wasn't progress. It was survival. This realization shook Schmidt deeply. It contradicted everything archaeology had taught him about steady development and improvement. Instead, he began to see human history as a pattern of creation and collapse, where knowledge was gained, lost, and rediscovered across millennia. The emotional weight of this idea haunted him. In private conversations, he expressed fears that history might repeat itself, that modern civilization too could rise, peak, and crumble under its own weight, just as those ancient builders had. He felt that archaeologists had been too eager to see continuity, too blind to the signs of discontinuity and failure written into the earth. The buried temples, the shift to crude tools, the silence that followed. To Schmidt, it all spoke of fragility. Humanity was not climbing a staircase toward perfection, but walking in circles around the same lessons. For Schmidt, that image never left him. He once told a colleague, "The earth remembers what we forget." To him, Göbekli Tepe wasn't just another dig site. It was a warning carved in dust and time. The terrifying timeline. Time has a strange way of revealing truths that words alone cannot. Beneath the soil of southeastern Turkey, radiocarbon clocks have begun to tick again, whispering the story of two civilizations, one that rose to impossible heights, and another that quietly rebuilt in its shadow. What scientists found in those dates did more than mark centuries. It shattered the idea that progress always moves forward. In 2013, researchers including Lee Clare, Oliver Dietrich, and Jens Notroff published a study that changed how the world looked at human beginnings. Using charcoal samples taken from the deepest layers of Göbekli Tepe, they pieced together a radiocarbon sequence that placed its monumental construction between 9600 and 8200 BCE. These weren't just random numbers. They placed Göbekli Tepe at the dawn of settled life, long before pottery, before writing, even before agriculture took firm root. The pillars, carved and aligned with purpose, belonged to a time when humans were still learning to live together, yet they built temples that rivaled the imagination of later empires. The dating confirmed something astonishing. The people of Göbekli Tepe built their sanctuary thousands of years before the pyramids or Stonehenge. Layer by layer, the evidence showed a civilization that peaked early, one that possessed knowledge of organization, engineering, and spiritual complexity that seemed almost out of place for its era. But just as suddenly as it appeared, Göbekli Tepe was buried, intentionally covered, and abandoned. The site's timeline ended abruptly, leaving scholars with one haunting question: what happened? The clues, it seems, lie at Göbekli Tepe, a site not far away. Its layers tell a quieter, more humble story. When archaeologists studied the soil and the tools found there, they noticed something striking. The artifacts belonged to a later time, the late pre-pottery Neolithic and into the pottery Neolithic period. In simple terms, Göbekli Tepe came after Göbekli Tepe. The discovery of pottery fragments, more domestic tools, and simpler buildings hinted at a world that had changed, a world rebuilding after something immense had fallen apart. Unlike Göbekli Tepe's massive T-shaped pillars and sacred enclosures, Göbekli Tepe's structures were smaller and built of mud brick. They were homes, not temples. The people here cooked, crafted small figurines, and lived in modest clusters. Their tools were simpler, their ambitions more practical. It was as if a population that once worshipped under towering stones had learned to live within walls of clay. This shift in architecture and material tells a clear story. These two places were not simultaneous neighbors, but stages in a timeline of collapse and recovery. Göbekli Tepe marked the peak of a mysterious spiritual age. Göbekli Tepe represented what came after: the survivors, the rebuilders, those who carried fragments of lost knowledge into a humbler world. Modern excavations under the Taş Tepeler project continue to connect the dots. Sites like Karahan Tepe, Sefer Tepe, and others show patterns that bridge the gap between monumental temples and simple villages. Together, they reveal a civilization's rhythm: the rise, the silence, and the return. But what force caused that silence? Was it nature, conflict, or something far stranger? With Göbekli's great temples buried and Göbekli Tepe's small homes rising in their place, one terrifying truth looms larger than ever. Civilizations may not simply progress, they may begin again after collapse. The collapse pattern. By the time the winds of change swept across the ancient world around 6200 BCE, the people who once gathered beneath the towering stones of Göbekli Tepe were long gone. Yet something about their disappearance fits eerily into a larger pattern, a rhythm of rise and ruin that seems woven into the very fabric of human civilization. Modern science calls it the 8.2 kiloyear event, but for the people of that age, it must have felt like the end of the world. Roughly 8,200 years ago, Earth's climate shifted in a sudden, violent turn. The planet cooled dramatically for more than a century, bringing dry, bitter winds across the Near East. Rivers that once fed fertile plains began to shrink. Rains became unpredictable, and the lush lands that had supported early farming communities started to wither. Researchers studying ancient cave formations have found evidence of this event in the form of chemical changes, sudden drops in oxygen isotopes that record a moment when the atmosphere itself turned hostile. For societies still learning to control their environment, this cooling event was catastrophic. Crops failed, food became scarce, and animals migrated to survive. The delicate balance between humans and nature snapped. Villages that once thrived on farming and shared labor found themselves on the edge of starvation. Hunters and gatherers might have fared better, moving with the changing seasons, but for those who had settled and built temples, like the people of Göbekli Tepe, the sudden shift would have tested every part of their existence. Klaus Schmidt and later researchers began to see the possibility that the decline of Göbekli Tepe was not just cultural, it might have been climatic. Monumental societies depend on stability, consistent weather, reliable crops, and cooperative communities. When those foundations cracked, the structures built on top could not stand. Complex societies, with leaders, rituals, and workers, are fragile. They require surplus food and shared belief to survive. Remove either, and collapse follows swiftly. After the collapse, the survivors scattered. When they rebuilt, their architecture was smaller, their communities simpler. Villages like Göbekli Tepe appeared, where life centered around modest homes and hearths instead of temples. The people had learned a painful lesson. Complexity brings glory, but also fragility. In their simplicity, they may have found resilience, a way to live through the chaos rather than be destroyed by it. Still, not everyone agrees that climate alone caused the fall. Some argue that social tension, changing traditions, or shifts in trade played equal roles. Yet the evidence of climate disruption fits too perfectly to ignore. Nature may have struck first and humanity simply followed its lead. If the ancients saw collapse coming and buried their world to warn us, what did they fear would return? And could their warning still be echoing through time today? The mirror of history. When Klaus Schmidt studied the stones of Göbekli Tepe, he wasn't just uncovering the past, he was staring straight into the reflection of our own world. The story that began more than 11,000 years ago in the hills of Şanlıurfa was not only about ancient hunters and temple builders, it was about humanity itself, rising, reaching too far, and falling again. Schmidt began to see that what happened at Göbekli Tepe was not a single event, but part of a universal rhythm, one that has echoed through every civilization since. History's greatest collapses share a haunting resemblance. The Roman Empire, which stretched across continents, crumbled under the weight of its own ambition, drained by wars, corruption, and famine. The mighty Maya cities fell silent after years of drought and internal conflict. Even the grand temples of Angkor were eventually swallowed by the jungle when the water systems that sustained them failed. Different lands, different eras, yet the same pattern: growth, excess, strain, and collapse. As the anthropologist Joseph Tainter once wrote, complexity carries a cost. When the cost becomes greater than the benefit, societies break under their own weight. Göbekli Tepe, in its brilliance, might have been humanity's first taste of this curse. The enormous T-shaped pillars, carved with animals and symbols, represented the pinnacle of early organization, a society capable of massive, coordinated effort. But such grandeur is never free. It demanded labor, surplus, and unity, all fragile in a world still learning to tame nature. Schmidt believed those stones told a tragic truth, that civilization's light burns brightest just before it fades. When Göbekli Tepe fell silent, Göbekli Tepe rose in its shadow, humbler, quieter, human. The shift was not only architectural, but spiritual. The cosmic carvings of gods and beasts gave way to small figurines of men and women crafted for homes rather than temples. The sacred became domestic, the divine became personal. Humanity had turned its gaze inward. This too is a pattern. After every great fall, civilizations begin again with simpler priorities: food, safety, family. Then, slowly, ambition returns and the cycle begins anew. Rome's ruins gave birth to medieval villages. The fall of Angkor led to smaller, more adaptive Khmer communities. The Maya descendants still live, rebuilding in the same jungles their ancestors abandoned. Collapse does not mean extinction, it means renewal at a lower scale. A painful lesson repeated over millennia. For Schmidt, the real revelation came not from the stones themselves, but from the mirror they held up to modern humanity. Our skyscrapers, megacities, and digital empires are not so different from Göbekli's stone circles, monuments to ambition, powered by fragile systems that can falter when resources thin or climates change. He warned that progress is never permanent, that the idea of endless growth is a comforting illusion. The ancients once believed their temples would last forever too. The most terrifying thought Schmidt shared with colleagues before his death was not about ancient ruins, but about us. He feared that humanity had already entered its next cycle, that the same forces which silenced Göbekli Tepe were stirring again. He urged his peers to see archaeology not as a study of the dead, but as a warning for the living. Before he died, Klaus Schmidt claimed the stones of Göbekli Tepe had spoken to him, not through words but through patterns. What did he discover that made him believe history was repeating itself right now? Schmidt's final warning. In his final years, Klaus Schmidt no longer spoke of Göbekli Tepe as just an archaeological marvel. He spoke of it as a mirror, one reflecting both the dawn and the possible dusk of humanity. After decades of brushing away layers of dust and time, he began to sense that the stones were not merely remnants of the past, but messages left behind. His talks became less about the what of his discoveries and more about the why. What could drive a society capable of such wonder to bury its own creations? And what if that same pattern was repeating again, right before our eyes? In lectures and interviews, Schmidt's tone grew darker. He warned that civilization was once again walking the same narrow edge that had undone the ancients. Climate instability, social inequality, the illusion of infinite progress, all, he said, were signs of fragility disguised as strength. To him, the collapse at Göbekli Tepe was not a mystery. It was a prophecy. Humanity had built something magnificent, but too heavy to sustain. It had demanded too much, from nature, from people, from itself. And when the balance tipped, they did not fight it. They buried it. In the months before his death, Schmidt's thoughts seemed to spiral deeper into this paradox. Among his recovered notebooks were sketches of spirals, concentric circles, and a single recurring word, cycles. One page bore a chilling line, "They knew." Another, almost illegible, read, "Burial by choice." Some of his colleagues dismissed it as poetic musing. Others believed he was hinting at a revelation, that the builders of Göbekli Tepe might have intentionally sealed their world, aware that their age was ending. What haunted Schmidt was not only the fall of those who came before, but the blindness of those who came after. Ziyar. He often compared the stone circles of ancient Anatolia to the glass towers of modern cities. Both, he said, were born of ambition and belief in permanence. Both required constant energy and order to survive. Yet both were built on unstable ground, environmental, social, spiritual. He saw in humanity's obsession with growth and consumption the same arrogance that had doomed the first temple builders. To him, the real tragedy was not collapse itself, but our refusal to learn from it. He believed the past was not distant, it was a loop. The more we rise, he once told a colleague, the more fragile we become. His final interviews carried the tone of someone desperate to be heard, a man who had seen too much of time's repetition. He warned that if we failed to heed the lessons buried at Göbekli Tepe, we would soon create new ruins of our own making. After his sudden death in 2014, scholars continued to study his unpublished notes. Within them, they found fragments of unfinished essays, sketches of ancient landscapes, and passages reflecting a mind both brilliant and burdened. His words, though fragmented, carried a single message, that humanity stands once again at a crossroads. Today, his warning feels eerily prophetic. We build upward, faster and higher, while the ground beneath us trembles, just as it once did at Göbekli Tepe. Schmidt's greatest discovery, perhaps, was not the world's oldest temple, but the realization that history's first collapse was a rehearsal for all that followed. Are we, thousands of years later, again building monuments on shifting foundations, blind to the fact that the collapse we excavate is the one we are living? Share in the comments